What is climate change? When we use a car, the engine makes a gas called CO2. The CO2 comes out of the exhaust pipe and floats up into the air. Because lots of people use cars, lots of CO2 is going up into the air. When we leave the TV or the lights on, that uses electricity. Electricity comes from a power station, and that makes lots of CO2. Aeroplanes make even more CO2 than cars. There is so much CO2 in the air that it's covering us like a big blanket.
This blanket of CO2 can make the air too hot.
This is called climate change. Sometimes the heat causes drought, when there's not enough rain and all the plants die. Sometimes the hot air makes great big storms called cyclones. Storms make big waves that smash up coral reefs.
The heat can warm up the sea, causing the corals to lose their colour and die, and the fish to go away.
How can we protect animals, plants, and beautiful places like the Great Barrier Reef? Let's go back to the start. There are lots of things we can do to make less CO2. We can cycle or walk to places instead of going in the car. We can make sure we switch off the TV and lights when we're not in the room. We can travel by bus instead of flying. If we make less CO2, we can help make the Great Barrier Reef a safe and happy home for all the animals and plants.
This is Earth, the planet in our solar system that we live on. However, our planet is not on a good path for continuing to sustain life. The Earth is facing the accelerating detrimental effect of climate change, also referred to as global warming. Well, what exactly is climate change? Climate change is defined as a long-term change in the Earth's overall temperature with massive and permanent ramifications. Climate scientists believe that this isn't caused naturally by the Earth, but by human activity. Earth's atmosphere consists of gases such as oxygen and nitrogen, and other gases known as greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane. Incoming light from the sun hits the Earth's surface. The Earth absorbs some of that energy, heating the surface of the planet. The rest of that energy gets reflected. Some of that energy goes back out into space, but greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide trap the energy and send it right back to the Earth's surface, heating it up even more. This is known as the greenhouse effect. Now, a little greenhouse effect is natural to the Earth and is a good thing to have, but a large greenhouse effect can be catastrophic, causing a lot of that energy to stay in our atmosphere and heat up the Earth at an accelerating rate. Some of the main human activity that emits greenhouse gases are fossil fuel burning, animals, agriculture, and deforestation, and waste and recycle pollution. Burning fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas, as well as gasoline, are some of the largest pollutants of carbon emissions. Not only that, but when fossil fuels are burnt and their gases mix with heat, they create smog, a thick air pollutant that is highly toxic. For example, Beijing smog is so thick and heavy that you can't go outside without some form of surgical mask or breathing filter. The massive amounts of excrement produced by livestock farms emit toxic gases such as hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, and methane into the air. Methane is 23 times more effective at trapping heat than CO2, and roughly 80% of these emissions in the US come from animal waste. Over 56 billion animals are globally raised every year for food purposes. That's 8 times more than the human population, and 8 times as much waste adding emissions to our atmosphere. Land used for growing animal feed and raising animals for food used a staggering 30% of the Earth's landmass in 2006, and the food production industry has only increased since. 7 football fields worth of land is bulldozed every minute to create more room for farmed animals and the crops that feed them. Bulldozing land and deforestation not only emits greenhouse gases, but it gets rid of plants, trees, and forests, the things on our planet that actually absorb carbon dioxide. The more we deforest our Earth, the less carbon dioxide it can absorb from our atmosphere. Solid waste landfills are some of the largest pollutants of methane gas in the United States. The average person produces 4.3 pounds of trash per day. That's 1,569 pounds of trash per year for one person. With the 7+ billion people that live on the globe, that's 11.6 trillion pounds of trash dumped into landfills every year. But how do we know that our human activity is the cause of accelerated climate change and not the Earth's natural process? Our civilizations produced a devastating 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide last year, which equals 700 trillion cubic feet of CO2. That's a little more than 100 Mount Everests of CO2. It's enough CO2 to fill the entire Grand Canyon 5 times. Or it's the equivalence of 19 million Empire State Buildings. The largest natural pollutant of the Earth are volcanoes. If we take the largest scientific estimate of carbon emissions produced by volcanoes every year, that's 500 million tons of volcanic CO2. But that's not even 2% of the nearly 40 billion tons of CO2 that our civilizations produced. Over the course of thousands of years, our climate goes through a natural climate cycle of carbon dioxide being absorbed and released into the atmosphere. But once the Industrial Revolution kicked in, burning fossil fuels became the necessity of manufacture and production plants, and the CO2 level shot up violently and have not slowed down since. The Earth has not seen this much carbon dioxide in its atmosphere for millions of years. Our planet with the greenhouse effect is like a bathtub being filled with more water than it can drain. Eventually, it will fill up with more than it can handle. But why should we care about global warming and climate increasing? The Earth's temperature has risen 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit over the past century and is projected to rise another 0.5 to 8.6 degrees Fahrenheit over the next 100 years. Animals and plant life are struggling to adapt to these conditions for survival. If even one species goes extinct, it can create a domino effect with the food chain. No living plants or animals means no living humans. Rising temperatures makes the Earth's oceans become warmer, which causes something known as ocean acidification, which rises the acid levels in the oceans from the carbon dioxide reacting with the salt water. Ocean acidification harms animal life and is what's causing the death of the Great Barrier Reef. This is a problem because about 1 billion people use ocean life as their main source of protein. Since the oceans are becoming warmer, the polar ice caps are melting, which has caused almost 65% of the polar ice caps to melt since 1979. The Earth loses on average 400 billion tons of ice each year. That's like a giant block of ice 4 miles long on each side, 64 cubic miles, that melts and is added to the ocean. The oceans fill with too much water, and the shores, like in Louisiana, can't hold all that water, and coastal regions get flooded and destroyed. Climate change also causes more frequent and intense natural disasters such as hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, heat waves, and droughts. So the question is, how do we stop this? Instead of burning fossil fuels, we need to convert to renewable energy such as solar and wind power, which emit zero carbon emissions when operating. Energy from the sun and the wind are infinite. Unlike fossil fuels, we will never run out of them. More solar energy falls on the Earth in 1 hour than all the energy that our civilizations consume in 1 year. Civil engineers from the Solutions Project calculated that we could power most of the world with only renewable energy if we just actually decided to do it. If we cut back on deforestation, not only does that reduce the amount of fossil fuels burned, but there will be more plants and forests actively absorbing carbon dioxide. If we use more reusable and renewable resources, this will reduce the amount of energy needed to create new products. This will also reduce the massive amount of landfill dumping that we do. That all sounds like great, efficient, and healthy ideas, but how can I help personally right now? you can drive an electric or fuel-efficient car. Replacing your regular car with a Toyota Prius, the average person can prevent the emission of about 1 ton of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Now, we all can't afford to just buy new and different cars, so to help, you can walk or bike places, take public transportation, or if anything, ease off the accelerator and make your car as efficient as possible. Use energy-efficient light bulbs. LED light bulbs use only a fraction of the power of incandescent light bulbs. Air dry your clothes instead of using power-guzzling machines like dryers. Turn off electronics or lights when you're not using them. Eat less meat or no meat at all. By replacing an omnivorous diet with a vegan diet, the average person can prevent the emission of about 1.5 tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. Reduce, reuse, recycle. And of course, spread your knowledge and concerns of climate change. Remember, climate change is very real and is drastically affecting planet Earth, our home. And although we are the problem, we can also be the solution.
This is a simple explanation of climate change based on an article in the New York Times. The average temperature on the surface of the planet has already increased 1.7 degrees Fahrenheit since 1880, which may not seem like much, but think about it this way. The heat from human emissions is roughly equal to 400,000 Hiroshima atomic bombs exploding across the planet every single day. Future generations are in big trouble. But for now, it'll gradually continue to get warmer and storms will grow more intense, with longer periods of drought in between. But longer term, if emissions continue to rise unchecked, the climate disasters will be so severe they will destabilize entire nations, send millions of refugees across borders, cause widespread extinction of most species on Earth, and melt the polar ice caps, leaving most of the world's coastal cities several feet underwater. All this could take centuries, but something like the sudden collapse of agriculture would trigger immediate chaos in society. Best case is we get our act together and begin to rapidly bring emission levels down. Meanwhile, Earth turns out to be less sensitive to greenhouse gases than we currently believe, plants and animals adapt quickly, and major technological breakthroughs help society limit emissions and adjust to climate change. But these are all the opposite of what we're actually seeing, so the only thing in our control is to limit emissions using all available tools and best behaviors currently at our disposal. Worst case, the collapse of food production causes spiraling prices, and as our capitalist utopia breaks down, billions starve as our world gets violent and messy real quick, kind of like a zombie apocalypse, but with extreme hunger spreading chaos instead, so yeah, still just like a zombie apocalypse. This would be coupled with the melting of the Antarctic ice sheet, leading to rapidly rising seas that would force us to abandon many of our greatest cities and all of the social and scientific progress that we were making within them. Adding insult to injury is the fact that many of the emissions were emitted while building these now abandoned underwater metropolises. If emissions continue unchecked, we're looking at a total rise of between 80 to 160 feet, which would occur if all the ice in the poles melted. So the oceans will rise. The real question is how fast. Scientists only have Earth's history to base their predictions on, which suggests that the rate has occasionally hit 1 foot per decade, so we'll have to adapt to an altered coastline sooner or later, but probably much sooner than later, because computer forecasts only give us a range of future possibilities. The most important evidence comes from the study of past climate conditions, which clearly show that every time the amount of carbon dioxide in the air rises, the Earth warms up, ice melts, and the ocean rises. What's important to remember here is that we are in uncharted territory. Humans are pumping carbon dioxide into the air far faster than nature ever has before us. Scientists have been publishing strong evidence that warming is making drought and heat waves more frequent, causing heavier rainstorms and more severe coastal flooding. But while the internet has made us all more aware of weather disasters in distant countries, it's hard to prove these are all directly made worse by climate change. Canada and Russia both have vast frozen lands and could see some economic benefits from a warmer climate. Putin and the Russians, and until recently Canada as well, have been reluctant to make ambitious climate commitments, but expect that to change as these countries realize they will be swamped by millions of refugees from less fortunate nations. Libertarians and other political conservatives do not like the policies proposed to fight climate change, and have chosen to try and block them by actively undermining the science. This effort has been funded by the oil and coal industry, who favor making money above all else. As more resources are devoted to solving the problem, our chances at big technological breakthroughs are improving, but we still should be spending about 3 times as much money as we currently are on these efforts, according to several in-depth reports. You can reduce your carbon footprint by doing things like plugging leaks in your home insulation, installing a smart thermostat, taking public transit, taking less airplane trips, buying an electric car, and putting solar panels on your roof. A big one is eating less meat. But what's really needed is for you to speak up and exercise your rights as a citizen, because strong, collective action through state and national policies is how we'll make the most impact. Considering that we've been ignoring scientists' warnings since the 80s to limit emissions, we're pretty late in the game. But we've finally reached a moment where nearly every country in the world agrees this is a huge problem and seem ready to commit to taking at least some kind of action. Leading corporations will continue to make bold promises to do their part, low-emission technologies will improve, and many states and cities will go much further than any goals set by their national governments. The United States, the world's biggest economy, is finally starting to move aggressively, and China, the world's largest emitter, is beginning to recognize that it needs to do the same, as many of its megacities will be underwater if the seas rise too high. But it's up to us, the ordinary citizens, to continue demanding our political leaders tackle climate change, the hardest problem that humanity has ever faced. So like and share this video to help it spread. A special thanks to Justin Gillis of the New York Times for putting together the original article, which is linked in the more info section below. Until next time, thanks for watching TDC. I'm Bryce Plank.
Climate change is sheep produce methane as a major product in their digestive tracts. It makes its way into the atmosphere via what you might call the usual channels. Then there's nitrous oxide, N2O, also known as laughing gas. Nitrous oxide is produced when bacteria break down the nitrogen compounds in soils in the oceans. The use of nitrogen fertilizers in farming is increasing the rate at which nitrous oxide is being added to the atmosphere. Methane and nitrous oxide are emitted into the atmosphere in much smaller quantities than CO2, but they still have a significant effect on climate. When comparing the different impacts of these gases, we usually refer to carbon dioxide equivalence. This is a measure that is based on the potential that each gas has to contribute to global warming. This graph shows the equivalent amount of human-induced global warming attributed to the different gases. So we know humans are causing greenhouse gas concentrations to increase, and this in turn is contributing to planetary warming. But what can you and I do as individuals? How can we reduce our carbon footprint? First off, we need to understand how a carbon footprint is calculated. Let's look at sending a text message. Direct climate change impacts occur when we use a product, in this case my cell phone, to write a text message, and the recipient's phone to read it. This requires the use of electricity. If that electricity was generated by burning coal or natural gas, the text message has a carbon footprint. Indirect impacts occur during the production and distribution of the cell phones. For example, fossil fuels may have been used to supply power to the phone factory and then to transport the phone to the retailer. And then if I drove out to the mall to buy it, well, as you can imagine, calculating the carbon footprint of an action can be challenging. But just being able to make informed decisions when choosing one activity over another is what's really important. For example, I knew that sending a text message was greener than driving across town to share my news. In British Columbia, our households account for 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions. Let's look at some of the choices we can make to reduce that carbon footprint. Food production and consumption are large contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. When shopping, consider these 3 factors. How was it produced? From where did it come? And how did it get here? The term food miles is often used to describe the potential greenhouse gas impact of agricultural products. Generally speaking, locally produced foods are associated with fewer food miles. Foods that arrive by air have a much higher carbon footprint than those that arrive by ship. Likewise, produce that has been grown in heated greenhouses also has a high carbon footprint. Meat and dairy products have high carbon footprints because of the methane produced by cattle, and if there's deforestation to provide grazing land. But surprisingly, the easiest way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions associated with our food supply isn't watching what we consume. Instead, it's reducing what we don't consume. According to the Food Waste in Canada study, an estimated 40% of food is wasted after leaving the farm. Methane may be emitted when waste food decays in the landfills, so discarding food makes total emissions in the production and consumption cycle even worse. So, plant a garden, buy local, and eat your leftovers. Okay, so we know about the impact when food is flown to its destination. Well, we can be part of that same problem. Tourism accounts for an estimated 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and air travel is the most significant contributor to that percentage. Taking off and landing uses the most fuel. So booking multiple hops will emit more greenhouse gases. Based on average ridership, a train is usually the greenest mode of transportation, followed by an automobile carrying multiple passengers. However, if we include emissions associated with building infrastructure like rail lines and roads, the actual carbon footprint of a vacation can increase significantly. Transporting a family across the country or across the world burns a lot of fossil fuel and is expensive. Luckily for British Columbians, we live in one of the world's top tourist destinations. So think about pitching a tent in one of our great natural parks, or take the time to re-explore your own city. Nothing beats staycations. The carbon footprint of driving is influenced by several factors. First is the number of people in the car. Carpooling is an opportunity to save money and the planet. It even saves time when HOV lanes are available. Surprisingly, about 50% of the fuel consumed in city driving is used during acceleration. To reduce this, use the most efficient route, combine trips, and travel at off-peak times. Reducing idling time is also important. Idling for 10 minutes a day can produce a quarter ton of CO2 emissions each year. Maintaining your vehicle and checking your tire pressure at least once a month can reduce fuel consumption by as much as 10%. When buying a car, consider its city and highway gas rating. Smaller cars, eco and hybrid versions of cars, and now electric cars are available from almost every manufacturer. Starting off on the right set of wheels can save you many hundreds or even thousands of dollars a year. And instead of just passing that old jalopy on to someone else, Scrap It BC provides incentives to move older, higher polluting vehicles off the road. And finally, traveling by transit, bicycle, or even walking benefits more than just the Earth's atmosphere. It allows us to enjoy the added bonuses of physical activity and social interaction while saving money. Heating our homes is often our largest use of household energy. When our heating bills arrive each winter, we are reminded of the amount of energy it takes to keep warm. We are lucky in BC that most of our electricity is generated by hydro. Heating from electricity means your carbon footprint is low for now, but the demand for more electricity is creating the need for additional sources of energy. Homes that heat with oil or natural gas currently have a larger carbon footprint. Whatever your heating source, it is beneficial to use less fuel. So before we go any further, let's put on a sweater and turn down the thermostat by 1 degree. When you go to bed at night or leave on vacation, turn it down another 3 or 4 degrees. Draft proofing by plugging air leaks is a cheap and effective way to reduce energy consumption and has a fast payback time. In cold weather, use ceiling fans to distribute heat that collects against the ceiling. This will create a more consistent temperature in the room. If your feet are cold, your body will feel cold. By placing area rugs on cold floors, you may be less likely to crank up the thermostat. Making informed choices about transportation, food, and energy use at home is one of the best opportunities we have as individuals to reduce our carbon footprint. Every little thing we can do to reduce our individual or household carbon footprint will help to combat global warming. And just imagine the impact if hundreds of millions of us, particularly in the wealthy developed countries, were to join that parade. You can make a difference.